She stood at the kitchen door, hungry
Delia?
enough
Yes,
that
sir.
she only dared
Come on
ask
in, it's
for
cold
whatever
out
was
there.
left over
There's
from
food
someone
for you.
else's supper.
You
Not
shouldn't have
because she
risked
had
it.
lost her pride, but because she had no other
Maybe
choice
one
left.
meal wasn't worth it, but
The
you
man looked
are.
at her a long moment,
Sipped.
then, without a word, pulled out the empty chair beside his own place at the table. What she didn't know was that 3 weeks later, a lawman's badge would knock at that same door, and the man would have to decide whether one shared meal was worth risking his whole reputation to defend. Delia Marsh is running from an accusation she never committed, with nothing left but a tin box of memories and her grandmother's recipe book. When she timidly asks for kitchen scraps at the Kestrel Ridge Horse Ranch owner, Ezekiel Graves, a man who was once betrayed and learned not to trust anyone, quietly pulls out a chair and invites her to the table instead. But the past isn't so easily left behind, and when a deputy marshal arrives in Miles City, Ezekiel must choose between his own safety and his faith in a woman he has known only a few weeks. This is a story about dignity denied, trust given without condition, and a home rebuilt from the pieces of injustice. The stage had left her 3 miles outside Miles City, at a crossroads where the driver said he could go no further without doubling back toward Bozeman before dark. Delia Marsh had walked the rest of the way on foot, her carpet bag growing heavier with every mile, her shoes gone thin at the sole from 3 weeks of running. The first hard frost of the season had settled over the grass that morning, turning it the color of old silver. She could feel the cold coming up through what was left of her shoes. Kestrel Ridge announced itself before she saw the house. Split-rail fences stretching along both sides of the road, corrals holding horses that watched her pass with mild, incurious eyes. The barn was long and well kept, its boards fitted tight against the weather. Whoever ran this place cared about it. That much she could tell from 100 yards off. She stood at the edge of the yard for a long moment, before she made herself walk to the kitchen door instead of the front. It was where she belonged, she told herself. Where anyone in her position belonged. A man answered before she'd finished knocking. He was tall, sun-marked, dressed in the plain wool of a working rancher, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he doesn't yet understand. Not unkindly, just deliberately. "I don't mean to trouble you," she said. Her voice came out more composed than she felt. "I can chop wood, mend, harness, scrub a floor, anything you need done. I'm not asking for charity. I only wondered if there might be some supper left over I could earn." He didn't answer right away. He looked at her carpet bag, at her hands, at the set of her shoulders, which she kept square even though every part of her wanted to fold in on itself. "You've come a long way," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Far enough." He stepped back from the door. Not an invitation exactly, more like he was making room in his own mind before he made room in the house. Then he crossed to the table, pulled out the chair across from his own place, and set it square against the floor. "Sit down," he said. "Supper's not much, but there's plenty of it." She stood there a moment too long, unsure what to do with an offer that didn't come with a condition attached. She had learned these last weeks to expect a hook buried somewhere in every kindness. She searched his face for it and didn't find one. "Name's Ezekiel Graves," he said when she still hadn't moved. "This is my place, Kestrel Ridge." "Delia Marsh," she sat. The chair was solid beneath her reel in a way that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. He set a plate in front of her beans cornbread, a strip of salted pork without ceremony, the way a man does chores he's done 1,000 times before. He did not ask why a woman traveled alone with one bag and no destination. He did not ask what she was running from. He simply sat down across from her and ate his own supper in a silence that asked nothing of her. It was Ezra Coombs, the ranch's foreman, who came in halfway through the meal, stamping frost off his boots. He was older, gray at the temples, with the deliberate movements of a man who'd broken more bones than he cared to count. He looked at Delia, then at Ezekiel, and something passed between the two men that Delia couldn't read. "Miss Marsh is looking for work," Ezekiel said before Ezra could ask. "Cooking, keeping the house. That's so." Ezra's eyes were sharp, but not unkind. "Last one we had left in August. Married a freighter out of Billings." "I can cook," Delia said. "I ran a hotel kitchen in Bozeman for 5 years." She watched the word land Bozeman and forced herself not to flinch. Neither man reacted. There was no reason yet for them to. Ezekiel studied her for a long moment, the same measured look he'd given her at the door. "Room small," he said. "Off the kitchen. It's warm at least this close to the stove." "It'll do. Wages are $8 a month and you're bored. I don't ask questions about a person's past. I only ask that they do honest work while they're here." Something in his voice, plain without pity, made her look up and meet his eyes fully for the first time. Gray, calm, unhurried. He held her gaze a moment longer than the conversation required, and she felt it settle somewhere under her ribs, a small warmth she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she was ready for. She looked away first. "Honest work is all I know how to do," she said. He gave a short nod, as if that settled it, and rose to clear his plate. Ezra caught Delia's eye across the table and gave her the ghost of a wink, the kind of gesture that told her more about the ranch than any speech could have. This was a decent house. She hoped, sitting there with a full stomach for the first time in nearly a week, that it might stay that way. Outside, the wind picked up against the windows, carrying the first real bite of the Montana winter ahead. Delia wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and let the warmth of it seep into her fingers. She did not know yet what it would cost her to stay. She only knew that for tonight she had a chair at a table, and no one had asked her to explain why she deserved it. The trouble started the 3rd week, when Ezra rode in at dawn, short 4 head of cattle, and a temper to match. "Wolves, most like," he said, swinging down stiff from a night spent counting fence line by lantern. Or something walking on 2 legs pretending to be wolves. "Either way, we're down 4, and there's 40 miles of fence line between here and the north section that needs riding before we lose more." Ezekiel was already reaching for his coat before Ezra finished talking. "I'll take the north stretch myself tonight." "You rode out yesterday too," Ezra said. "Man needs sleep same as horses do." "I'll sleep when the herd's accounted for." Delia, setting bread to rise at the counter, said nothing, though she noted the particular set of his jaw, the one that meant the conversation was already over as far as he was concerned, whatever anyone else thought of it. He came back well after midnight, and she heard him in the yard longer than usual, moving slower than his horse did. By breakfast, his right hand was wrapped clumsy in a strip of cloth tucked half out of sight beneath his cuff, and he ate left-handed without comment, as though he expected no one to notice. "You're hurt," she said. "Caught it on a fence post. It's nothing. Let me see it." "It's nothing, Delia." His voice had an edge to it she hadn't heard before. Not sharp exactly, but closed the sound of a door being pulled to. He finished his coffee standing and went back out before she could press further. It was Ezra who told her the rest of it that afternoon, half apologetic, half amused. "Fell reaching for a post in the dark, likely sprained the wrist, good. Won't hear a word about riding into town to have it looked at. Never has not since his brother. Man'd rather work through broken bone than let on he needs help carrying a thing." That evening, the new man arrived, a lean, restless drifter named Silas Petty, hired on for the roundup season at Ezra's recommendation, all rope skill and idle hands. He took his supper at the long table with the rest of the crew, and his eyes tracked Delia's every movement around the kitchen with an open, unhidden suspicion that made her spine go rigid. "Didn't know Graves kept a colored woman running his house," he said to no one in particular, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Didn't figure him for that kind of arrangement." The silence that followed was immediate and complete. Ezekiel set his fork down with a deliberate quiet that carried more weight than shouting would have. "Miss Marsh runs this kitchen because she's the best cook this ranch has had in years." he said, not raising his voice at all. You'll speak to her the same as you'd speak to me, or you'll draw your wages in the morning and find work elsewhere. Petty muttered something under his breath and went back to his plate, but the damage of it sat in the room a long while after a small, ugly thing that wouldn't quite dissolve. Later, once the crew had cleared out, and Ezra had gone to check the horses, Delia found Ezekiel alone at the table, his wrapped hand resting awkward in his lap. You didn't have to say all that in front of everyone, she said. Yes, I did. I meant about my hand, he said, misreading her, or perhaps not misreading her at all, only deflecting the moment, as he did most moments that asked something honest of him. I meant both things, she said, and sat down across from him, reaching for his injured hand before he could pull it away. She unwound the cloth carefully. The swelling was worse than a fence post scratch had any right to cause. This needed tending yesterday. You let it sit through a full day's work rather than say a word. I've managed worse. That's not an answer. I was quiet a long moment, looking at his own hand in hers, as though it belonged to someone else. I don't like asking people for things, he said finally. Learned a long while back that needing help just gives people a reason to leave when you need it most. I'm not going anywhere over a sprained wrist, Ezekiel. I know that. He said it too quickly, like a man arguing with himself more than with her. Knowing it and believing it aren't always the same thing. She bound the wrist properly, using a strip of clean linen and a splint of kindling from the woodbox, working with the same patient efficiency she brought to everything in that kitchen. He let her, which she understood by then to be its own small admission. Next time, she said, tying off the linen, you tell me, whatever it is. I didn't promise it outright. That wasn't his way, but he nodded once, and something in the nod told her he meant to try. The letter sat unfinished on the kitchen table for 3 days before Delia finally gave up on it and fed it to the stove. She had started it a dozen times. Dear Ruth, it always began, and then nothing true would come. She could not write that she had fled Bozeman in the night with nothing but a carpetbag and a stolen hour's head start. She could not write that lawmen might already be asking after her at the stage depots between here and there. So she wrote about the weather instead, and the horses, and the good bread flour to be had at the mercantile in town, and none of it said anything at all. She was folding the ashes of that letter into the stove grate when her hand brushed the lining of her carpetbag, and something crackled beneath her fingers. A torn scrap of paper wedged deep in the seam, forgotten since Bozeman. She drew it out and unfolded it carefully. It was a gambling marker, the kind saloons kept on hand, for men who ran short of coin mid-game. Vernon Ashby's signature was scrawled across the bottom, dated 3 days before the theft, the sum owed scratched out and rewritten twice larger each time. She remembered now she'd found it caught under the office door the morning after a night. Vernon had come through the hotel, loud and reckless, smelling of whiskey, and losing badly, arguing with a man in the hallway about a debt. He swore he'd settle by week's end one way or another. She'd thought it none of her business at the time. A cook did not question the owner's son. She sat very still, staring at the marker in her hand, understanding for the first time how long the truth had been sitting in her own bag unnoticed, while she carried the blame instead. She was still holding it when Ezekiel came in for his afternoon coffee, his wrist still splinted, moving with the careful economy of a man learning reluctantly to favor an injury rather than ignore it. "What's that?" he asked, nodding at the scrap in her hand. She told him. All of it, the argument in the hallway, the marker, the debt Vernon had sworn to settle. Ezekiel listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, his gray eyes fixed on her with a patience that made the telling easier than she'd expected. "That's not nothing," he said when she'd finished. "That's a thread. Might not be enough on its own, but it's a thread. I should have said something back then. You said something now. That's what matters." He reached across the table, not for the marker, but for her hand, his splinted fingers awkward, but deliberate around hers. "You've been carrying that alone a long while." "I've been carrying a lot of things alone a long while. I know something about that," he said, glancing down at his own bound wrist, a rare admission of the thing they'd argued about only days before. She almost smiled at that. "Careful, Mr. Graves." That sounded very near to a joke. "Don't get used to it." That evening, after Ezra had gone to check the horses, and the new man, Petty, had taken his sullen silence off to the bunkhouse, Ezekiel lingered at the table instead of heading to bed, turning his cup in slow, patient circles. "You don't talk much about where you're from," he said. Not a question. He had a talent for leaving room in his sentences for her to fill or not fill as she chose. "Kentucky first," she said carefully. "Bozeman most recently. Long way between the two, longer than it looks on a map." He didn't press further. He simply nodded, and she found herself grateful again for a man who knew how to let a silence rest without trying to mend it. "You're a fine cook," he said instead after a moment. "Best this house has seen." It was such a small thing to say, and it undid her more than she expected. She busied herself with the dish towel so he wouldn't see her face. "Thank you," she managed. "Wasn't flattery, just fact." He stood, collected his hat from the peg by the door, favoring his splinted hand out of habit now instead of stubbornness. "Good night, Miss Marsh." "Good night, Mr. Graves." He paused at the door a half-second longer than he needed to, as though deciding whether to say something else, and then he was gone into the dark, his boots crunching over the frost-hardened yard. Delia stood alone in the kitchen a long while after the fire burning low, the gambling marker still on the table before her, evidence of nothing, yet but no longer forgotten, no longer buried at the bottom of a bag she was too frightened to unpack. She folded it carefully and tucked it inside her mother's tin box alongside the photograph and the recipe book. The growing collection of things she had once been too afraid to hold on to. She thought of her grandmother's hand in the margins of that recipe book. A woman who had known her mother always said exactly what she wanted and never apologized for taking it. Delia had spent years being careful instead. Careful with money, careful with trust, careful with wanting anything so much that its loss might break her. She was no longer certain that kind of caution would serve her here. Through the window, she could see Ezekiel in the last gray light, moving slower than usual, toward the barn, his splinted hand tucked against his chest, and she thought with a clarity that startled her that she wanted very much to keep being the person he let himself lean on. She did not write another letter that night. She would write one soon enough, she decided. But this time it would say something true. The trip into Miles City had been Ezekiel's idea, though Delia suspected it had as much to do with getting them both away from the tension Silas Petty had dragged into the bunkhouse as it did with the flour running low. He hitched the wagon before she'd finished her breakfast dishes, his splinted hand still awkward on the traces, but steadier than it had been a week before. "No sense you walking to town alone in this cold," he said when she protested. She could manage the errand herself. "I've business at the feed store besides." It wasn't strictly true, she suspected, but she didn't argue. The ride in was pleasant enough, the wagon wheels crunching over frozen ruts, their breath fogging in the sharp morning air. Miles City spread out ahead of them, false-fronted buildings along a wide dirt street, the Yellowstone glinting cold and silver beyond the rooftops, soldiers from Fort Keogh, moving in and out of the shops in their blue coats. Bell's Mercantile smelled of coffee beans and new leather and lamp oil. And for a moment, standing in the doorway, Delia let herself simply enjoy it, the ordinary pleasure of a well-stocked store, ribbons and tinned goods and bolts of cloth stacked to the rafters. She had barely reached the counter when she heard it, a familiar voice too loud, drifting in from the feed store next door through the shared wall. Silas Petty apparently arrived in town ahead of them, on some errand of his own, holding court, with a pair of idle ranch hands. "Graves has got himself a housekeeper wanted for thieving back in Montana territory," if half what I hear is true," Petty was saying, his voice carrying clear enough to reach the mercantile. "Man's too soft-hearted for his own good taking in strangers off the road, without asking a single question." Delia felt the words land in her chest, like stones one after another. Beside her, Mrs. Bell, the shopkeeper, who had never once looked at Delia with anything warmer than suspicion, went very still behind the counter, her eyes flicking toward the shared wall, and then back to Delia's face with new and unwelcome interest. Ezekiel, who had followed Delia in a step behind, set his jaw and walked straight through the connecting door to the feed store without a word of explanation. Petty. His voice, when it came, was measured, unhurried, and entirely without heat, which somehow made it more unsettling than shouting would have. "You've got something to say about my household, you say it to me, not to half the county through a feed store wall." Petty's bravado faltered under the weight of Ezekiel's calm. "Didn't mean nothing by it, Graves. Just talk. Talk costs a man his wages on my ranch." Ezekiel's tone didn't rise, didn't sharpen it, simply closed the same quiet finality Delia had heard the night he'd defended her at the supper table. "You're done at Kestrel Ridge. Collect your pay from Ezra and be gone by sundown." The feed store fell silent. Petty opened his mouth to argue and thought better of it, gathering his hat and slinking toward the door. Instead, the ranch hands around him suddenly very interested in the sacks of grain at their feet. Ezekiel came back through to the mercantile and found Delia standing exactly where he'd left her, her chin level, her hands folded tight in front of her apron, in the old familiar posture of a woman bracing for a blow that hadn't landed yet. "You didn't have to send him off on my account," she said quietly, once they were back out on the boardwalk, the cold air sharp after the store's warmth. "I sent him off because a man who talks careless about the people under my roof isn't a man I trust with anything else either." He handed her up into the wagon, his splinted hand steadying hers longer than the courtesy strictly required. "Wasn't only about you, Delia, but it was some about you. I won't pretend otherwise." She looked at him a long moment, searching the way she'd searched his face that first night at the kitchen door for the condition hidden beneath the kindness. She found again nothing but plain honesty. "Thank you," she said. "Wasn't a favor, just what's right." He climbed up beside her and took the reins, guiding the horses out onto the frozen road toward home. "Town'll talk regardless. I'd rather they talk knowing where I stand than wondering." The ride back was quiet, but it was a different quiet than the one that had carried them into town, warmer, more settled, their shoulders close on the narrow wagon seat, jostling together over the rough road, until neither of them bothered pulling away. Delia watched the fence posts pass, feeling something in her chest, ease that had been tight since Petty's voice first carried through that shared wall. She did not know yet what the whole town would make of what they'd overheard, or how far word might travel before the winter was through. She only knew that for the first time since Bozeman, she did not feel entirely alone in carrying the weight of it, and that the man beside her splinted hand, and all had chosen without hesitation to stand exactly where the trouble was thickest. The colt's name was Ash, and he did not like the halter, and by the third week of trying, Ezekiel had recruited Delia to help simply because the animal seemed to settle when she stood nearby. "Horses know a patient hand," Ezra said, watching from the fence rail, with the satisfied air of a man who'd been right about something. "You've got one Miss Marsh whether you know it or not." She hadn't known it. She'd never worked with horses before Kestrel Ridge had spent her working life in kitchens and laundries and hotel offices, but there was something in the colt's wary eye that she recognized the particular fear of a creature that had been handled roughly once and hadn't forgotten it. "Slow," she murmured, more to Ash than to anyone else, easing the rope through her fingers. Nobody's going to hurt you here." Ezekiel stood on the colt's other side, his splinted hand finally free of its wrapping, though he still favored it out of habit. When they both reached to steady the animal's head, their hands met over Ash's neck. Neither of them pulled away right away. The colt shifted uneasy, and they stood there a moment too long, her fingers warm beneath his, both of them, looking anywhere but at each other, until Ash tossed his head and broke the spell for them. They were still working the colt through his paces. An hour later, when the sky changed, Delia noticed it first, a strange yellow-gray light pressing down over the ridge, the wind gone suddenly still, in the particular ominous way Ezra had warned her meant weather coming fast off the mountains. "Storm," Ezekiel said, already reaching for Ash's lead. "Bad one by the look of that sky. We need to get the far pasture herd moved before it hits." They rode out together, the two of them, and Ezra splitting the work between them, but the storm outran their planning entirely, the first snow arriving in a hard, blinding sheet while they were still a mile from the nearest shelter, an old line shack Ezekiel's father had built decades before. Visibility dropped to nothing. The wind found every gap in Delia's coat and turned her hands to numb, clumsy things around the reins. It was Ezekiel who found the shack in the whiteout, more by memory than sight, and got them both inside before the worst of it hit the small stove, catching after several frozen, fumbling minutes with flint and kindling. They sat close by necessity, wrapped in the single blanket the shack provided, the wind screaming outside loud enough to swallow conversation for a long while. When it finally settled to something bearable, Ezekiel spoke into the dim firelight, his voice rougher than usual. "Louisa left in the spring, my brother died," he said without preamble, as though the storm had stripped off whatever caution usually held the words back. "Told me the ranch was too much grief for one woman to marry into. She wasn't wrong exactly. I wasn't much of anything that year but grief and stubbornness." "Stubbornness," Delia repeated softly. "I didn't let her help either. Didn't let anybody help. Told myself a man who needed help wasn't much of a man at all." He looked down at his hand, still faintly marked from the splint. "I've done the same thing to you this past month more than once. Kept things from you I should have said plain. You told me about your wrist eventually, only because you wouldn't let it drop." A faint, rare smile touched his mouth. "You're a stubborn woman yourself, Delia Marsh. I've had to be. I know it." His voice softened further, the firelight catching the gray of his eyes and turning them almost warm. "I mean to be better about it. The asking. The letting someone stand beside me instead of carrying things alone." She reached over and laid her hand over his, the way she had once before on the porch rail. Except there was nothing accidental in it this time. His fingers turned beneath hers palm to palm, and they sat like that a long while as the storm raged outside the shack's thin walls, needing nothing more than the warmth of the other's hand to say what neither of them was quite ready to put into finer words. The storm broke by morning, leaving the world outside scoured white and impossibly quiet. They rode back to find Ezra had managed the herd well enough without them, and the ranch, though buried under a foot of new snow, stood exactly as they'd left it. But something between the two of them had shifted out in that line shack, something that hadn't existed before. The storm drove them together, an honesty neither of them had offered anyone in a very long time, and a fragile, tender understanding that they intended from here forward to stop carrying their hardest truths alone. The rider came in on a Thursday, and Delia knew what he was before he'd even swung down from his horse. It wasn't the badge pinned to his coat that told her, though, that came plain enough once he drew close. It was the particular way he sat his saddle upright, watchful, a man used to reading faces for the truth people tried to hide in them. She was hanging wash on the line when she saw him turn in at the gate, and her hands went still on the wet cloth, her whole body suddenly coldly awake. Ezekiel came out of the barn before the rider had finished dismounting, wiping his hands on a rag, his stride unhurried but direct. He placed himself, without seeming to think about it, a half step ahead of where Delia stood. "Afternoon," the rider said. Deputy Marshal Jasper Reyes out of Bozeman, looking for information on a woman might have passed through this way. Delia Marsh goes by. Wanted on a theft charge, cash taken from a hotel strongbox back in September. Had some talk reach my ear out of Miles City besides from a drifter looking for work at the saloon. Seemed worth riding out to confirm. Delia understood then what Petty's careless mouth had cost her even after he'd been sent off the ranch. A rumor once loosed did not simply vanish with the man who'd started it. She kept her hands folded in front of her apron, her face composed the way she had learned to hold herself through every hard moment of her life. She did not look at Ezekiel. She did not trust her face not to give something away if she did. "Can't say the name means much to me," Ezekiel said, mild as ever, though Delia caught the faint tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there a moment before. "We don't get much traffic out this far before spring." Reyes's eyes moved past him to Delia, taking her in with the same careful, cataloging look he'd probably given every stage depot and boarding house between here and Bozeman. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat, "might I ask your name?" The silence stretched half a second too long. Delia felt it in her chest, like a held breath. "Delia," she said finally, because a lie now would only make the truth worse later. "Delia Marsh, I keep house here." Something flickered in Reyes's expression. Not triumph exactly, but the settling of a man who'd found what he came for and wasn't sure yet what to do with it. "I've a description matches you close enough, ma'am. Hotel owner in Bozeman says his office was short $400 the night you left town sudden. Says you had access to that strongbox, regular being trusted with the kitchen accounts." "I didn't take that money," Delia said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, though her hands hidden in her apron folds were shaking. "I know how that sounds coming from the person accused. I've no proof to offer you standing here. Only my word." Reyes studied her a long moment. He did not look like a cruel man, only a tired one doing a job that had likely worn most of the softness out of him years ago. "Words not evidence, ma'am. You understand I've got a duty regardless what I believe standing here." Ezekiel stepped forward, then, closing the last half step of distance between himself and Reyes, his voice dropping into something quieter and harder than Delia had heard from him even in the feed store with Petty. "She's worked this ranch a month now. Never taken so much as a spare biscuit without asking. I don't know what happened in Bozeman, but I know the woman standing in my yard, and she is not a thief. With respect, Mr. Graves, a month isn't a long acquaintance to stake a man's word on. It's long enough for me." He didn't so much as glance at Delia when he said it, but she felt the weight of the words all the same. A promise made plainly in front of a stranger without needing her permission first. Reyes looked between them, something almost like understanding, crossing his weathered face. I'll need to write up my report before I take any action," he said finally. "There's a telegraph office in town. Give me a few days to send word back to Bozeman, confirm particulars. I'm not in the business of dragging innocent women off ranches on a hotel owner's say-so alone. But I've got a duty regardless, and I mean to see it done proper." "A few days," Ezekiel said. "Fair enough." Reyes touched his hat again, swung back up into his saddle, and rode back toward the road without another word, leaving the yard, in a silence so complete Delia could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. "He's going to find out about the theft charge either way," she said once the dust had settled behind him. Her voice cracked on the last word, the composure she'd held through the whole exchange finally giving way. "There's nothing to confirm that clears me outright. The only truth anyone in Bozeman will vouch for is that I was in that office the night the money went missing." Ezekiel turned to face her fully, and there was nothing careful left in his expression now, only a fierce, quiet certainty that steadied her more than any words could have. "Then we find the truth that does clear you," he said. "However long it takes. Together this time, not you carrying it alone, and not me pretending I can fix it without your help either." She looked up at him, and for the first time since she'd fled Bozeman in the dark, with nothing but a carpetbag, she let herself believe she might not have to face what came next by herself. The letter from Fort Keogh arrived 2 days later, carried out by a young corporal who didn't linger long enough for coffee. Ezekiel read it standing in the yard, his jaw tightening by degrees as his eyes moved down the page. "Quartermaster's heard talk," he said when Delia asked. "Says word's going around town that I'm harboring a woman wanted for theft. Says the Army values the character of the men it contracts with, and he'll need assurances before next spring's remount order goes through." The Kestrel Ridge horse contract was not a small thing. Delia had come to understand that much in her weeks at the ranch. It was the difference between a hard winter and a ruinous one. The income that let Ezekiel keep Ezra on wages and buy feed enough to see the herd through to spring. "You should let me go," she said quietly, "before it costs you the whole ranch." "No, Ezekiel, no." He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket, his voice flat and final in a way that no longer surprised her the way it once had. "I didn't take you in to hand you back the moment it got difficult. That's not the kind of man I mean to be. And I already told you I don't aim to carry hard things alone anymore. That means you don't either." But the town had already made up a good deal of its mind. Delia felt it the next time she went into Miles City, the way conversations dropped when she entered a room. The way strangers watched her hands too closely, as if expecting her to slip something into her apron pocket. She kept her chin level and her voice even the way she always had, but it cost her more than it once had now that she had something at Kestrel Ridge worth protecting. That night, unable to sleep, she packed her carpetbag by lamplight. It seemed the only decent thing left to do to disappear the way she'd disappeared from Bozeman before her presence cost Ezekiel everything he'd built. She was halfway to this gate, her breath fogging white in the cold, when his voice stopped her in the dark. "Where do you think you're going?" She turned. He stood on the porch in his shirt sleeves, no coat, as though he'd come running the moment he heard the door. "Away from here," she said. "Before Reyes comes back. Before the Army pulls the contract and Ezra's out of work and you've lost everything on my account. I won't be the reason you lose this place, Ezekiel." He came down the porch steps and crossed the yard to her, and there was something raw in his face she hadn't seen before, not even out in the line shack during the storm. "You think this ranch means anything to me without you standing in that kitchen?" His voice was rough, stripped of its usual composure. "I spent years telling myself needing anybody was a weakness. You've spent a month proving me wrong about that one small thing at a time. I'm not going back to handling everything alone now, and I am not letting you walk out that gate to spare me a hardship I'd rather face beside you." She stood frozen in the frost-hardened yard, her carpetbag still clutched in one hand, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. "Stay," he said, quieter, now gentler. "Let me lose the contract if it comes to that. I'd rather lose the Army's business than lose you. And I'd rather ask you plainly to stay than let my pride talk me into standing here silent while you walk away." She let the carpetbag fall into the snow between them. "All right," she whispered. "I'll stay." He reached for her then, and she let him her cold hands, finding the warmth of his chest, and for a long moment neither of them said anything else at all. The whole frozen yard silent around them. But for the sound of their own held breath, two people finally choosing to carry the same weight together instead of alone. The idea came to Delia 3 nights later in the restless hour before dawn, when sleep wouldn't come. She sat up in the dark of her small room off the kitchen, the gambling marker from her tin box spread before her on the coverlet, turning over every detail of that last night in Bozeman until one piece of it caught and held. Ruth Callahan, the hotel's laundress who came in early to start the boilers before the rest of the staff arrived. Ruth had been in the hallway outside the office that night. Delia remembered passing her on the stairs, remembered Ruth's basket of linens, remembered the argument in the hall that Ruth must have heard as clearly as Delia had. She brought the idea to Ezekiel over breakfast, and by mid-morning they were both at the kitchen table with paper and ink drafting a letter between them. "We ask her plain," Ezekiel said, "whether she saw or heard anything that night. No accusing anybody by name. Just ask what she remembers." They sent it that afternoon. 2 weeks passed with no reply at all. "She might not want the trouble of it," Delia said on the 14th day, staring out the kitchen window at a landscape gone entirely white with winter. "A laundress crossing the hotel owner's son. That's a risk to her position, same as it was to mine. I understand it even if it costs me." "Give it another week," Ezekiel said. "Some decisions take longer to make than others." The reply, when it finally came, arrived apologetic and halting Ruth's handwriting, cramped with evident nerves. "I have thought on your letter every day since it arrived," she wrote, "and I confess I was afraid to answer it. Mr. Ashby's family has considerable influence in this town, and I have a widowed mother depending on my wages. But I have carried the truth of that night uneasy in my conscience long enough. I did see Vernon Ashby in the hallway, drinking and arguing loudly about a gambling debt 3 nights before the money went missing from the office. I should have spoken up sooner. I hope this letter finds you safe and finds justice done however late it comes." Delia read it twice through her hands unsteady before she carried it out to where Ezekiel was working in the barn. "It's not proof outright," she said, "but it's a thread same as the marker was. Together, they might be enough to ask harder questions." "There's more we can pull on," Ezekiel said, setting down the tack he'd been mending. "You said he pawned a watch the week you left. A pawnbroker's ledger would have his name on it plain, and a date close enough to matter. They wrote to the pawnbroker that same evening, and this reply came faster, though no less useful for its speed. A ledger entry dated the day after the theft, recording a gold pocket watch pawned by one Vernon Ashby for the sum of $90, description and initials matching precisely what Delia remembered. It was Ezra who noticed reading over the letters spread across the kitchen table that the sum pawned, $90, sat suspiciously close to the debt, scrawled across the bottom of the gambling marker Delia still carried in her tin box. "Add the two together," Ezra said, "and it's not hard arithmetic to see where a man short on one and flush on the other might have found the difference." Silas Petty, gone from the ranch weeks, now had left one useful thing behind him. Despite himself, word of his gossip had reached far enough that even the Miles City land office clerk, when Ezekiel called on him quietly to ask how such matters were typically brought before the town, seemed already half persuaded there was more to the story than a simple theft charge against a housekeeper. "Bring your evidence forward proper, Mr. Graves," the clerk said, "and I expect Deputy Reyes will hear you out fair. He's not a man inclined to railroad anybody whatever gossip says otherwise." Delia sat that night with all 3 pieces spread before her on the kitchen table. The marker, Ruth's letter, the pawnbroker's ledger entry, and felt for the first time in months that the truth was no longer something she carried alone in the dark, but something she and Ezekiel had built together, piece by patient piece, the way she built order into a kitchen, or he built trust into a fence line. "It's enough," Ezekiel said, reading it all over her shoulder, his hand resting warm against the back of her chair. "It's not certain, but it's enough to bring before Reyes and let the truth finish the rest of the work itself." Delia folded the letters carefully into her tin box alongside the marker and allowed herself cautiously to hope that the long road from Bozeman might finally be drawing toward its end. Jasper Reyes read through all 3 pieces of evidence at the kitchen table 2 days later, his expression unreadable until he set the last letter down and looked up at Delia with something that might have been apology. "This is more than I expected you'd find," he said. Enough that I'd be remiss not to bring it before Ashby's own family, directly, rather than let this drag through the winter unresolved. I've a mind to wire Bozeman and have young Ashby sent west under guard to answer for himself, provided his father allows it. A man who values his hotel's reputation might prefer that to a public inquiry back home. It was Reyes who suggested the confrontation take place in town, at the land office where half of Miles City did its business on a Saturday morning, rather than out at the ranch, where only Ezekiel and Ezra would witness it. Man deserves to answer for a lie in front of the same kind of crowd that heard the accusation, Reyes said, when he rode out again a week later, with word that Ashby's father, eager to protect the hotel's standing, more than his son's comfort, had agreed to send Vernon west to answer the charge directly. Vernon Ashby arrived pale and sullen, flanked by a Bozeman deputy, who looked thoroughly unimpressed with his charge. Delia recognized him the moment he stepped down from the coach, not merely his face, which she remembered clearly enough, but the particular restless way he held himself. The same reckless, cornered look he'd worn in that hallway, the night she'd found his marker, arguing loud about a debt he swore he'd settle one way or another. She had carried that memory 3 months without understanding its weight. She understood it now. He denied everything at first, right up until Reyes laid Ruth's letter and the pawnbroker's ledger entry side by side on the counter in front of him, in front of the gathered crowd of shopkeepers and ranchers who'd come to see the spectacle. The date matched. The initials matched. The amount $90 pawned against $400 taken accounted for exactly the sum his own gambling debts required once Reyes pressed him on the arithmetic in front of everyone present. "There's also this," Delia said, stepping forward and laying the torn gambling marker on the counter beside the rest. "Signed in your own hand, dated 3 days before the theft. I found it wedged in my carpet bag the morning I fled. Must have caught there the night I picked up the linens outside the office where you dropped it arguing with a man in the hallway." Vernon Ashby stared at his own signature a long moment, and something in his face finally cracked open. Confession exactly at first, but a collapse, the look of a young man who had never imagined the weight of his lie landing so squarely, so publicly, on someone else's shoulders instead of his own. "I never meant for it to go so far," he said finally quietly to the counter, rather than to the crowd. "I meant to pay it back before anyone noticed the shortfall. When the money turned up short, and my father started asking questions." He didn't finish it. He didn't need to. Delia stood very still through all of it, Ezekiel close beside her, and felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight for months finally begin to loosen. "Miss Marsh," Reyes said once it was done, removing his hat properly, for the first time since she'd met him. "I owe you an apology for the trouble this brought you, and my word that the charge against you is withdrawn full and clear." "Thank you, Deputy," she managed, though her voice shook with the release of it. It was Ezekiel who moved first, closing the last of the distance between them, in front of the whole gathered town. The same street. The same shopkeepers who'd once counted her change too slowly and watched her hands too closely, and took her hand in his, plain and unhidden, for anyone at all to see. "This is Delia Marsh," he said to no one in particular, and everyone at once, his voice carrying clear across the quiet street. "She keeps my house and she has my whole trust, and I'd be obliged if this town remembered that going forward." Something in his voice and the simple certainty of it brought a hush over the gathered crowd that felt to Delia like the whole town exhaling at once. She looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and neither of them seemed to care any longer who was watching. He kissed her there in the street, brief and a little unsteady, the first time either of them had let the truth of what had grown between them show itself plainly in daylight, and the sound that went up from the small crowd gathered outside the land office was not scandal, but something closer to a ragged, surprised kind of cheer. Delia laughed, through sudden tears, her hand still caught in his, and thought that she had come to Montana territory, asking for nothing more than scraps from a stranger's table. She had never imagined she might leave that street with her whole name restored and a man's hand in hers who had no intention of ever letting go. Winter settled in earnest over Kestrel Ridge in the weeks that followed, the kind of deep, clean cold that turned the whole valley silver and quiet. The Army's contract had held after all. Reyes had ridden out to Fort Keogh personally to set the quartermaster's mind at ease, and Ezekiel, for his part, had stopped waving off help wherever it was offered, whether from Reyes, from Ezra, or from the woman across his kitchen table. The ranch moved into its slow season with the particular contentment of a place that had weathered a hard thing and come through whole together rather than alone. Delia's kitchen had never run so well. She'd long since stopped keeping her tin box hidden on the high shelf. Her mother's photograph sat now on the mantel where anyone might see it, and her grandmother's recipe book lay open on the counter, most mornings, its margins slowly filling with Delia's own notes alongside the old ones. The gambling marker stayed tucked inside, still not as a wound any longer, but as a reminder of how far the truth had traveled to find her. It was an ordinary evening supper cleared away, Ezra gone early to the bunkhouse with a nod that seemed lately to carry a knowing sort of smile in it. Ezekiel sat across the table from her the way he had that very first night, though nothing about the two of them sitting there was the same as it had been then. "I've been thinking on something," he said, turning his cup slowly, the old habit she'd come to read like a book. "About that first evening you came here. I remember it well enough. You asked me for scraps, whatever I could spare, however little." He set the cup down and reached instead for her hand across the worn wood of the table. "I've thought since then that it was the finest thing that ever happened to this house, you standing at that door. I don't want you thinking of your place here as something you have to keep asking for, Delia. Not the chair, not the kitchen, not me." She felt her breath catch, watching him rise from his seat and come around to kneel beside her chair, instead his hand still holding hers. "I'm not a man of pretty words," he said, "and I expect you know that plain enough by now. I've spent most of my life thinking a man ought to carry everything himself, and you've spent this whole winter proving to me how much lighter a thing is when it's carried by two. So I'm asking you plain, the way I should have learned to ask things a long while ago. Will you marry me? Will you let this be your table because it's yours, not because anybody granted it to you out of kindness?" Delia looked down at him, at the steady gray eyes that had watched her that first frozen evening, without pity and without judgment, only patience, and felt the whole long road behind her. Bozeman, the accusation, the frightened nights on the run settle at last into something like peace. "Yes," she said, and found she was laughing and crying at once. "Yes, Ezekiel, I'll stay. I'll marry you." He rose and kissed her, then slow and certain, in the warm quiet of the kitchen that had become somewhere in the space of a single winter entirely her own. They were married in the small church in Miles City come spring, with Ezra standing witness and half the town in attendance, including, to Delia's quiet astonishment, Mrs. Bell from the Mercantile, who brought a length of blue calico as a wedding gift, and offered nothing but warm words to go with it. Ruth Callahan sent a letter of congratulations all the way from Bozeman, tucked inside a card that read simply, "I always did think you deserved a fair chance. I'm glad the world finally gave you one." Delia wore blue on her wedding day, sewn by her own hand from cloth bought on that difficult trip into town, and carried nothing but a small bundle of prairie sage picked from the ridge that morning. Years later, when their own children were old enough to ask about the beginning of things, Ezekiel liked to tell it simple the way he told everything. "Your mother came to this house asking if she might have the scraps from the kitchen," he'd say, and Delia would smile from across whatever table they happened to be gathered at, the same table still worn smoother now by years of use. I pulled out a chair instead. Best decision I ever made in my life. Took me a good deal longer to learn the rest of what she taught me, that a man's stronger for the people he lets stand beside him, not the things he carries alone. He makes it sound simple. Delia would add every time, reaching for his hand, the way she still did without thinking. It wasn't simple. It was worth every difficult mile of the road that brought me here. The chair at that table was hers, now had been hers for years, no longer empty, no longer waiting. It held in its worn and steady wood the whole quiet truth of what they'd built together, not out of desperation, not out of charity, but out of two people choosing again and again to make room for each other at the same table for the rest of their lives.
This was never really a story about a deathbed or a name cleared. It was a story about what happens when someone chooses to see you fully, not as a burden to be managed, but as a person worth a chair at their own table, and about a man who learned slowly and honestly that the truest strength is the kind that lets itself be shared. What this story stirred in you? Was it the moment he pulled out that chair, or the moment he stood beside her in front of the whole town? I would love to know which part stayed with you. If you enjoy riding along with Delia and Ezekiel tonight, give this video a like and subscribe for more story like it. There's another one coming soon, and I'll be glad to have you back for it. Until then, take care of yourself and keep writing.